Our topic tonight is Jesus' Jewish roots. So the historical Jesus, we had a lecture on the historical Jesus a few weeks ago, and the historical Jesus was Jewish. So that Jesus was born into a family that was ethno-religiously Jewish. That shouldn't be surprising or controversial information. But unfortunately, I think this fact has been obscured and even forgotten by many even observant Christians. So historians of the historical Jesus, like, for example, John Meyer, who has written a long 5-volume study about what we can find out or what we can possibly learn or know about the historical Jesus, try to remind people of the Jesus' Jewish origins. And indeed, Meyer's 5-volume study is actually called A Marginal Jew. So that's his name for Jesus as one of his many biographers. So no contemporary portraits of the historical Jesus exist. So although Jesus' movement ultimately inspired Christianity, which became a very powerful and large and the biggest religion in the world and so forth, during his own lifetime, though, he and his followers lacked the importance and the wealth that was necessary in antiquity to create portraits that survive. So when we see, like this picture I have here is from a sarcophagus, in other words, someone's coffin, and it's carved in stone and so forth. This is only possible for very rich people. The vast majority of the population didn't have this kind of wealth, and they weren't making portraits and so forth. The earliest Christian texts that survive, including the canonical Gospels, they actually fail to give a detailed description of Jesus. So the Gospel of Mark doesn't say, oh, and he had brown hair and olive eyes or whatever it would be. None of those kind of descriptions, that he was tall or not, that's not part of the text at all. Portraits only become frequent when Christianity did become an elite religion. In other words, when there were enough wealthy Christians that they could start carving images on the sides of their sarcophagi, or when there are churches or places that could be decorated by wealthier people who could commission artists to make portraits. And so really the earliest portraits of Jesus come from the 3rd and 4th century. Like this particular one, like I say, that is from Roman Gaul. And so this is a portrait of Jesus, the risen Christ, and you can see the Roman couple here are kind of clinging to his legs. It's kind of the couple who are probably for the sarcophagus, in other words, who are hoping to seek resurrection, is one of the reasons here. So when these Roman portraits occur, here's another one from another sarcophagus in the south of France. When they occur, they tend to picture Jesus as a contemporary Roman, garbed as either like a Roman senator or a philosopher, in this case wielding a wand. So in this particular image, Jesus here in the middle is in profile, and he's got a wand in his hand, and he is using that to indicate that he's raising here Lazarus, who's shown as being very little, who is coming from the grave, so still wrapped in his mummy-like shroud, right? And so these earliest pictures, you can kind of see in this one and the previous one, Jesus rarely actually has a beard, although sometimes the risen Christ is bearded. So Romans are not alone, though, in depicting Jesus like themselves. So in other words, they're not trying here to try to figure out what the historical Jesus would have looked like. They're just imagining it based on the kind of character that he was, a person who was a teacher, a leader, and so on, and that's what teachers and leaders in Roman society look like. So, for example, picturing a Jesus who looks like you. Ethiopian Christians. Ethiopia is one of most ancient Christian nations, and they have a long, long tradition of picturing Jesus here washing the feet of the disciples, and here are the 12 apostles and so on. Jesus washing the feet, and he looks very much like an Ethiopian man, as always is the case in Ethiopian imagery. Chinese Christians, they have pictured, here's John the Baptist baptizing Jesus, again, using traditional Chinese art and traditional Chinese-looking people. Medieval Europeans, like everybody else, also pictured kind of a European-looking Jesus. Still here, not bearded. This is an 8th century of the Common Era Frankish depiction of Charlemagne that was commissioned and given to Charlemagne. So this practice continues. So in the movie, The Passion of the Christ, kind of controversial movie, there's a pretty, let's say, European-looking Jesus, an American actor. His ethnicity is like half Irish, quarter Swiss, quarter Slovak. So Jesus in this isn't, there's no attempt here to make the guy look Middle Eastern or something like that, which is maybe fine, except for if you look at the other characters, the villains in the movie, where they are very much coded for Jewishness. So in terms of how the stereotypes are in terms of noses and so on. And so they're not actually Jewish actors, but they're coded Jewish, right? And so there's an Iranian actor here playing Herod Antipas, an Italian actor playing Annas Ben Seth. So these are, this is an ongoing problem and a double standard of Jewish depiction that is very problematic already. And unfortunately, this double standard within the European Christian West has very, very deep roots, and it's an ugly, violent history. Anti-Semitism, crusades and so on, pogroms, everything, laws, expulsions of the Jews, massacres, all the way up to the Holocaust, and still continuing to this day, anti-Semitic hate crimes and so on continue to the present day. And these are rooted in and have the same kind of sentiment here as is shown in a 13th century English Book of Hours, a prayer book. And so Jesus, who is Jewish, is with other Jews here who are obviously, they're not all, they're coded as stereotypes and things like that, and actually semi-inhuman. And Jesus isn't one of them, really, in terms of this, in this sense, in this kind of ugly sense. All right, there is a long tradition of kind of willful Christian ignorance about these kind of things. So lots of people who grow up in the English-speaking world, in backwoods churches and so on, just presume that the King James Bible, which has this very strange way of talking and is sort of a church speak. People sometimes use that when they pray as well and so forth, that maybe is the language actually that Jesus spoke. So for example, in the 1960s, when then the Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau, the father of the current Prime Minister, when he was campaigning for bilingualism, the idea that Canada has, what's at that time anyway, we have more than two because of the First Nations languages, but we have, for the settlers, two foundational languages of both French and English. There was a woman from the prairies who, stood up and said, if English was good enough for Jesus Christ, English is good enough for me. It's probably an apocryphal story, but it's the kind of story that that is told because this is kind of an attitude that people can have, and a misconception that people continue to have. So we're just going to say, in terms of us, and as we're doing this exploration of Jesus' Jewish roots, we can say Jesus is not an Anglo-Saxon. There have been a number of, there's a number of actually Christian offshoots and sects that have actually taught this, and as a doctrine, and in kind of in a racist way. So Anglo-Israelitism, the idea that that English-speaking peoples and Scandinavians and so on, and Americans then by their descendants, are actually the true lost tribes of Israel. That's taught by churches like the Worldwide Church of God. A version of that was taught in the Restoration tradition, although not as strong doctrine, but the idea that Mormons will get a patriarchal blessing that says they are from the tribe of Ephraim. The implication is that they're descendants of one of the lost 10 tribes and so forth. we talked in our lecture on debunking the Da Vinci Code about the sort of anti-Semitic French text that underlies the anti-Catholic English text of the Da Vinci Code, and that French conspiracy theory was actually Franco Israelitism, and the idea that the French are the true Israel. Again, another one of these kind of race-based conspiracy theories turned, sometimes in some cases religious beliefs. So Jesus, the historical Jesus, was not an Anglo-Saxon. He wasn't a Frank. He didn't speak King James English. So while a case can be made in Christianity to depict Christ, the Christ of Scripture, in your own culture. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the Ethiopians making Jesus look like them, or the Chinese making Jesus look like them, as long as all of the characters, in the stories are Ethiopian looking, right? In other words, if it's only Jesus and the good characters in the story who are Ethiopian looking, and then you do some kind of stereotype looking character for Judas and Herod and so on, then you're doing that anti-Semitic thing that was going on in both that medieval English illuminated manuscript that I was showing, the Book of Hours, and of course also in Passion of the Christ. So Herod, Judas, Caiaphas, and so on should also be depicted Chinese among the Chinese Judas. I'm sorry, Chinese Jesus. Okay, so who was then the historical Jesus? A marginal Jewish Galilean, I'm saying here peasant, but isn't exactly peasant, not a farmer probably, but from the vast class of the common people. The Gospel of Mark calls him a carpenter, which is to say probably a woodsmith. So we think of carpenters as people going out and building houses. It's more likely building, if that is an actual bit of data that goes back to the actual historical Jesus and not the invention of Mark or someone predecessor of Mark. The implication of that is it's somebody who is, let's say, fixing like wooden tools or cabinets or these kind of things, things that you need, tools that are made out of wood. And so therefore it's a profession that is socially far below the wealthy elites. It's maybe above the poorest peasants, the peasants who don't own any land and are just sharecropper kind of things, where they're working on the land whenever they can for part of the harvest, but less than, let's say, very rich peasants, which there also were, comparatively rich anyway. So the historical Jesus was from the Jewish village of Nazareth, and Nazareth is located in a mixed Jewish, Greek, and, for lack of a better term anyway, Syro-Phoenician, which is to say the Aramaic-speaking kind of natives of the whole area of Syro-Phoenicia, Canaan, Judea, that area. So that region of Galilee, and all of that is under the Roman dominion. So he's in a very kind of multi-ethnic part of the Levant. So just like we talked about when we talked about the historical Jesus, from a Christian perspective, it's, I think, important just as a basis to frame this, that Christians need to actually separate their conceptions of Jesus. So people think of Jesus Christ, they have more than one thing in mind. So on the one hand, they're definitely thinking about the guy, the historical figure, who, like I say, in our previous lecture that we had, I think we did a pretty solid job of demonstrating there certainly it was a historical Jesus, or we can conclude there was a historical Jesus with a great degree of certainty. But what we can say about the historical Jesus with that same great degree of certainty is very small. You can say a lot of things from that foundation, depending on your reading of the sources and so forth. You can go like John P. Meyer and decide that lots of things can be traced to the historical Jesus, or you can be like people who are a little bit more minimalistic and a little closer to like the source criticism and think that, well, we can't say that with that level of assurance. But in any event, the historical Jesus can only be approached through the academic disciplines of literary criticism and history, along with the context you can get from archaeology, but there's no remains, so there's nothing really archaeological to tell us about the historical Jesus other than the context. And so, yes, while you think of Jesus as a guy who lived once and walked around and did things, you can't actually know what those things are for the most part. You can only do what you can know with history, which is to say an approximation, what the most likely things that might have happened, what is unlikely to have happened, and so forth. That's how you have to approach the historical Jesus. Meanwhile, we also then, on the other side, in Christianity, have to separate out the Jesus Christ of Scripture then from the Christ of theology. So in the Christian canon, there are 4 canonical Gospels, and Jesus figures into other texts of the New Testament, and frankly, in the way Christians interpret the Hebrew Bible, there's lots of passages that Christians read Jesus into in there too. And so those are the portraits that we get in Scripture, and Scripture is used in the life of the church, and so both for liturgical, religious reasons and things like that, and also to tell teachings and so on that are part of the lived church experience. But again, just because it says it in Scripture, that doesn't mean that happened. That's not the same thing as the historical Jesus. In fact, the Scripture, none of the Scripture are histories or written by historians, and we've shown that in the last lecture. And then finally, the Christ of theology within Christianity is also very different. So the Christ of theology is a theological idea, an understanding of God and the divine, the one God, through a second person of God, the Logos, the glory, and so forth, the risen Christ. Those are the different ways that kind of Christians understand God. It is, again, different from the historical Jesus in the sense that they're remembering the historical Jesus is an academic construct. The guy who lived is gone in the sense that no one who was alive back then is still alive. We have no contact. The past is gone, We only have Jesus Christ of Scripture, the Christ of theology, and what, in terms of the historical Jesus, academic disciplines can show us. So these conceptions are not the same. They're approached using completely different disciplines, which yield very different results. And so just be aware of that, especially for Christians who are watching. All right, so let's get back into the academic side of it. So there are challenges when we try to reconstruct the historical Jesus. So we talked a little bit about this in the last lecture. So Jesus left no writings. Jesus left no artifacts or remains. There's all kinds of artifacts. You'll have everything, as we talked about, from the Shroud of Turin to the more splinters of the true cross, Jesus, the cross on which Jesus is crucified, enough to build a whole castle or whatever out of the wood, because there's so many of them. In other words, these are relics that may have a lot of antiquity. They may go all the way back to the 4th century in some cases, and but generally speaking, they mostly only go back to the Middle Ages and so forth. And even ones that are like Holy Blood or any parts of Jesus, those are not actually have nothing to do with the historical Jesus. No pre-Christian accounts of the Jesus movement survive. So Jesus, even the New Testament tells us that nobody was calling themselves Christian until kind of like halfway into the book of Acts. In other words, after the apostles get going, after they're planting colonies or communities around the Eastern Mediterranean and so forth, it's only then that Christianity is start to being called Christianity. Jesus has a movement, but it isn't Christian during his lifetime. In other words, it wouldn't be called Christian, and it isn't actually very much like the later Christian churches that grew up in all their different varieties. We've had a lecture on early Christianities. And so almost all of our detailed early accounts of Jesus are from Christians who introduce anachronisms. They tell the story based on their own time and place, like everyone does. And they assume, based on what things are like and how they understand Jesus to be, in other words, the fact that they already have a faith claim and an understanding that Jesus is the Christ, that Jesus is the Messiah, then they reinterpret the past based on that present belief. So a bunch of different examples of anachronisms. The Gospel of John is probably the most anachronistic, the least. The historians find that it has the least connections to the historical Jesus of the 4 canonical Gospels. So in the Gospel, Jesus frequently speaks of the Jews as if he were something other than a Jew. So the author of the Gospel of John, actually there's multiple authors, are living at a time when their community, their early Christian community, has been kicked out of the synagogues for talking about Jesus too much and other things like that. And so now they are becoming a separate sect where they don't consider themselves to be Jewish, and they use the word Jews to talk about their former co-religionists that they're no longer a part of. So that's an anachronism. So Jesus, in his lifetime, wouldn't talk about the Jews at all. He's a Jew. Everybody he's talking to are Jews. So there's not, he would never make that kind of distinction. So for example, in John 9:22, it records, the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. So this is an anachronism. This is probably something that occurred in the 80s of the Common Era. And so in something that is very important to the community, included the authors of the Gospel of John, who included this event in their story, and said it as happening back at the time of Jesus when it had happened much more recently. And so that's why they are already thinking of their former co-religionists as the other, and so they call them the Jews, as opposed to, since they're not calling themselves that anymore. So, as always, the texts reflects the author's context. So they're unaware of all the changes that have happened in whatever it's been, 30, 50, 60, 90 years. And so, therefore, they continuously retroject anachronisms into Jesus's context. They're not aware of the context of the historical Jesus. All right, so we have a lot of Christian sources. The earliest is Paul. We have the 4 anonymous canonical Gospels. There's the other New Testament writings. There are also non-canonical Gospels and writings. And then later, we have the writings of the early church fathers. And all of these are written for purposes other than to narrate history. Well, some of the church fathers eventually were trying to write history, but they are also trying to promote the faith while they're doing it. So even the ones who are trying to write history, and they're not actual historians, they're good historians, they are still nevertheless have their biases, as everyone does. And so all of the Christian sources have to be read in light of Christian biases. Even the sayings that we have that are preserved that maybe go back to Jesus. In some cases, I think lots of them probably do. These sayings are not recorded, however, in their original tongue. So Jesus would have been, as a spoken language, would have been Aramaic. That's where the teachings would have been composed in and preached. All of the disciples and so on in Galilee and in Jerusalem would speak Aramaic, which was the lingua franca of the time. People weren't speaking Hebrew anymore on a regular basis. They might have used it in reading the Hebrew Torah, the Hebrew Bible, but when they would preach, they would have spoken their regular language. That regular language, Aramaic, is a related language. It's the language that had been the language of the Babylonians and so on, the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire. So it's the very related Semitic language that overtook Hebrew, and because you could use it to speak to anybody in the kind of Middle East. In the same way that later, Arabic, when Islam spread, Arabic, which is a related, again, Semitic language, that displaced languages like Aramaic, Egyptian, and so forth. Okay, so those teachings were in Aramaic. That would have gone into oral traditions. So in other words, Jesus didn't write anything down, and so instead he taught in parables and pithy sayings, things that people could remember. They'll have like a 3 parts or something like that, and so they're easy to remember how each one of them kind of goes. Nevertheless, changes could be made during an oral tradition. And in the oral tradition, we also translate into Greek, and so and then that has to be transmitted orally in the Greek speakers, until finally the teachings are actually written down in Greek in sources attributed to Jesus, for example, in the Q Sayings Gospel, Mark, Thomas, other sources. So the fact that we have so little primary source material for Jesus is actually very, 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 very normal. People have lots of people think, oh, well, there's so little about Jesus, that must mean that he didn't exist. We're not going to go back into that. But anyway, it's actually only a minuscule fraction of people, comparatively, to today, were literate, and only a tiny fraction of the records created in the ancient world have survived to the present. Most lives went unrecorded, especially members of the lower social orders like Jesus and his followers. For it to even have been recorded, then there had to have been somebody to copy it throughout the entire tradition, even like important thinkers, even Roman emperors. Claudius wrote a history of the Etruscans that we'd really like to have if you're interested in Etruscan history, which I am. and even though he's the emperor of Rome, his book didn't survive because nobody was around who cared enough to copy it in the Middle Ages, and so it didn't make it down to us. There's of what did survive, though. So I mean, this is not only survival. This is now also the notice anybody had. So for the Romans, they had a lot more important things. Galilee and even Jerusalem are very much on the frontier of their empire, and more or less what's happening over there is they're not too worried about it until they have to have a war about it, and so forth. And so there's very little that is recorded in the early sources anyway, the early Roman sources about Jesus. So Tacitus, writing in 116 of the Common Era, says there was a movement called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And so he knows at least the basics of the story. There's a sect in his day called Christians. They take their name from a guy, Christ. That guy was executed by Pontius Pilate under Tiberius. Pliny and Suetonius also record about a Christus as the name of a leader of this movement. So just about minimal kinds of mentions. We talked about in the historical Jesus lecture that there are in the writings of the Judean historian, the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote books in Greek in the 1st century of the Common Era that were commissioned by the emperor, that there are references that he makes to John the Baptist, to Jesus, and to James, the brother of Jesus, which unfortunately have been contaminated, or at least the one about Jesus has been contaminated by the Christian copyists. And so we read the other two in that lecture, the John the Baptist one and the James, the brother of Jesus one, because those are the ones that are likely not contaminated. But the Jesus one is absolutely contaminated. There's no doubt that a Christian copyist has messed with this one. So let's read it. So Josephus says, actually he didn't really say this, but anyway, this is what is in the Josephus as it's come down to us. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds, and he was a teacher of such people as accept truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ. And when, upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross, those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of Christians so called after him has still to this day not disappeared. So you can see, Josephus, the Jewish historian, did not become a Christian, and so there's no reason to imagine that, he'd write more about Jesus if he cared this much about Jesus. But anyway, the idea that he's declaring in the middle of this that he was the Christ, and he's not even sure if you should even call him a man, Although, on the other hand, a Christian probably should, because he's fully human, fully divine. But anyway, whatever. So this is and that he's also very much explaining here that he was resurrected, right? And that had been foretold, and there's 1,000 other marvels. All right. So what are we looking at here? So lots of scholars have pointed out that this is kind of a weird passage where there are all of these kind of Christian testimonies, but then the Christian testimonies in some ways are maybe even arguing with the rest of the text. And so there was a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. So these are like back and forth with each other. And so if we blot out the Christian kind of testimonies, if we want to call him a man, he was the Christ. He appeared on the third day, restored to life. There's all these miracles and so on. If we blot those out, we have left over something that could very easily fit into Josephus. So about this time, there lived Jesus, a wise man, for he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many Greeks, and when upon the accusation of several principal men among us, Pilate had him condemned to a cross, those who came to love him did not cease, and the tribe of Christians so called after him has not, to this day, not disappeared. So it's possible that this is what an original Jesus passage would have looked like, and Josephus then would be saying that he is a wise man, and so maybe a person who is known for as an exorcist. That certainly, casting out evil spirits and things like that is something that, and also doing faith healings and so on, certainly jives with the Christian sources and so on. And like his name, the tribe of Christians is called after him and so on. Okay. So from all of this, and from what we did in our Historical Jesus lecture, we established a kind of a bare bones portrait of the historical Jesus. So among the details of his life, he's a marginal Jew from Nazareth. So he doesn't have that royal genealogy that both the authors of Luke and Matthew create their own different ones that don't actually relate to each other, totally made up for those. He is a disciple of John the Baptist, probably, who began to teach his own disciples after John is put to death. And after amassing his own following, he is crucified by the Romans in Jerusalem under Pontius Pilate. All right, so let's look a little bit now at these Jewish roots and what does it even mean to be Jewish in Jesus' day. This is a model of Herod's temple, which is Herod the Great's rebuilding of the Second Temple as it had been started under Ezra and before him Zerubbabel. So most of us are familiar with modern Judaism. Nearly every expression of Judaism today, there's a couple, like the Samaritans and a couple others that are not, but almost everything is actually descendant of Rabbinic Judaism in the same way that most of Christianity, descends from Nicene Christianity, because so many of those other early Christianities have died out, and so many of the other types of Judaism, sects of Judaism, and so on, have also died out. So Rabbinic Judaism took over as the mainstream Judaism in the 6th century of the Common Era, and thereafter other sects and versions and variants have died out. So the Rabbinic Judaism begins with the early rabbis who are kind of contemporary with Jesus in some cases. In some cases, they're beginning in the generations before that, and then continue on long after Jesus. So it's during the Second Temple period. And then the movement evolved in the wake of the Roman destruction of Jerusalem, which destroyed that temple, and also the sort of sacrifices, animal sacrifices, other sacrifices that had been central to what Judaism was about. So there's only going to be one temple according to the Torah, and the temple is going to be there, and the religion is focused on that. After that temple no longer exists, after the Jewish people are expelled from Jerusalem in the next generations, and the city is refounded as a Roman pagan town, Aelia Capitolina, diaspora Judaism, the Jews that are in exile everywhere who are not able to have a temple, can't have that be their focus. And so the rabbis start making Torah and Torah interpretation now the focus. Another successor from Second Temple Judaism is Christianity, which did grow out of Second Temple Judaism. It was also impacted by the destruction of Jerusalem. We talked about how the church that was led by Jesus' brother, James, the brother of Jesus, James the Just, sometimes called the poor of Jerusalem, that they had to flee when the city was destroyed, and they went to Pella. And once they were in Pella, that group was eclipsed in its importance and became less and less important until it was ultimately declared a heresy by the rest of the Christians and eventually went extinct. So how is it a successor? So understanding their religion to be universal, Jewish Christians like Paul, who began his life, he was born Jewish and began his life as a very active Pharisee, as he says. He began to convert once he converted to his own kind of Christianity, he began to convert non-Jews to that faith, to Christianity, which then evolved from a Jewish sect into an independent religion of the Greco-Roman world. And as it spread beyond the borders of the Roman Empire to Ethiopia and Armenia and so on, the East, India, and beyond, it becomes its own separate thing. Although for a whole bunch of time, people who aren't Christian and aren't Jewish, the pagan Romans kind of still thought of the Christians as being some kind of kooky, newfangled Jews for a while. And anyway, that happens all the time. So I want to just look then, just a chart of what we've just been talking about, continuity and innovation in Judaism. It's kind of a timeline here that is more conceptual, but I've divided the main line here between First Temple Judaism, Second Temple Judaism, and then Rabbinic Judaism. First Temple is that temple that traditionally is built by Solomon, whether there actually was such a king or not, but in any event was the temple when religion in the kingdom of Judah is formalized and centralized at the end of the kingdom. So that is destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE with the destruction of the first temple. Then in 516, the exiles return. They build the Second Temple, which exists until 70 of the Common Era, 70 AD, when the Romans then destroy the Second Temple. That's the Second Temple period. And then in the wake of that, the rabbis try to put the pieces together. They compose over the course of a few hundred years the Talmud, and eventually become the mainstream of Judaism, Rabbinic Judaism, which exists to this day. So out of that, the Samaritans come from a split that occurs essentially between the First and Second Temple periods. So the Samaritans are people that stay in the land when the exiles are taken away to Babylon, and when the exiles come back, the exiles don't want the Samaritans to have anything to do with them, and so they become their own separate sect, essentially their own separate religion ultimately. And then, likewise, we mentioned out of the Second Temple period, Christianity is its own thing, beginning as a Jewish sect, which I'm calling here the Poor of Jerusalem, maybe, James, the brother of Jesus' group. And at the same time as that, there are other sects, the most famous of which are the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. The Essenes and the Sadducees, like the Poor of Jerusalem, kind of get wiped out with the destruction of Jerusalem and the wars that follow. The Pharisees live on, and in some cases sort of evolve into the rabbis in some ways, and in some ways they're a little different. And of course, now we kind of are aware of, in the modern times, in North America anyway, there are other sects in Israel, but the Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox groupings that occurred in modern times in Judaism as branches. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the kind of influences throughout all of this time, and this is a very quick thumbnail, but I think it might help to put a little bit of this context, put a little bit of the background into context. So the Levant, this area, Syria, Palestine, Judah, the Aramaic-speaking zone is at a crossroads. So it's at a crossroads between Africa and Egypt and Asia, and specifically between the much bigger lands and civilizations of Mesopotamia, Assyria and Babylon on the one hand, and Egypt on the other hand. And so in that First Temple period, the Iron Age kingdoms of Israel and Judah are quite little and powerless in a way in the faces of these. They have a lot of cultural flowering, but it's very hard to for a place that has such a small hinterland to imagine it like taking over Egypt or it taking over Assyria or Babylon, whereas the Assyrians and Babylonians and Egyptians are much more able to muster much larger armies and take those over. And so Egyptian power and influence are affecting the Iron Age kingdoms of Israel and Judah in the First Temple period, as are the Mesopotamians. So when the Mesopotamians destroy the two kingdoms, what ends up happening is the First Temple is destroyed, the Samaritans stay in the land, but exiles flee to Egypt, and those become Egyptianized, and others, the captives, are taken away to the Babylonian captivity, where they are Babylonianized. And so there are big influences that happen with the two diaspora groups. And now, from this time onward, the majority of Jews actually are not going to be living in the land. So they are going to be in these diaspora communities, which is where the religion really takes off. Even though the religion has been focused on the temple, and even in this moment when there's no temple, is still kind of focused on getting back and making a temple. Nevertheless, the religion is really experienced and really takes off in exile in these diaspora communities. So when the Persians conquer the Babylonians and let the exiles go home to rebuild the Second Temple has lots of Mesopotamian, Persian, and Mesopotamian Persian influence, because it's not an independent kingdom. It's a little province under the Persian Empire. And the people have started speaking, for example, Aramaic and so on, and they are and even the king, he's not a king, but anyway, the descendant from the house of David, the last descendant who goes back to lead the people there, Zerubbabel, has an actual Babylonian name even. So he's even adopted, doesn't even have a Hebrew or Jewish name anymore. So there are a big community of diaspora Jews at this point still in Egypt, but their influence is less during this whole Persian period that stretches from the return in 516 through till 332 BCE. So the Persian district is much smaller and reduced from the former independent kingdom of Judah. The Persian-era Jerusalem is tiny, so there's maybe 500 to 15 inhabitants. The returning exiles, like I say, rejected the local Israelites who remained in the land, calling them impure, and they created a rivalry with those, especially the ones that were in charge of the neighboring district of Samaria, and that became that origin of that Jewish-Samaritan split we were talking about. Okay, so the next period. Alexander the Great conquers the whole Persian Empire, and this now suddenly introduces Greek influence. And so Persian and Mesopotamian influences very much wanes now, because now the influence is from this Hellenizing empire of Alexander and Alexander's successors. And I'm still going to say Egyptian influence, which was on the rise again, because now Alexandria, the city founded by Alexander to become the new Greek capital of Egypt, becomes the cosmopolitan and intellectual and cultural capital of the Hellenistic world. And this place already, like I say, has a bunch of diaspora Jewish population, and at a certain point, the Jewish population there are more Jews there than anywhere else in the world. So that has an influence on the people that are back in the kingdom, in the land. What's originally provinces of the successor empires under the Greek empires under Alexander's successors, so the Antigonids and the Ptolemies. But later it becomes an short-lived independent states under the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, as they're called, the Hasmonean dynasty. That dynasty, though, we'll get to it here. So the Maccabean revolt takes off in 167 BCE. So Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king of Syria, forbids Jewish worship and practices, and he sets up an idol to Zeus in the Jerusalem temple. That causes a revolt. So the revolt is led by members of the Hasmonean family, beginning with a rural priest named Matthias, and it's followed by his son, Judah Maccabee, the Hammer, and so that's why these guys are known as the Maccabees, kind of popularly, although it's usually, the family is called the Hasmoneans, and that revolt is the origin of the Hanukkah celebration that people are familiar with. So from there, the Hasmonean kingdom grew as especially the Seleucid kingdom fell into decline. So the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, are not Davidic, and so they didn't have the right lineage to be called the Messiah as far as the Hebrew Bible was concerned. Nevertheless, they are the kings. They're also not of the Zadokite or Sadducee line of priests, but nevertheless, they ruled Jerusalem as both high priest kings, which caused their rejection from some of the other priests, those priests then who left the Jerusalem elite, and they went to the side of the Dead Sea, where they founded a colony in Qumran, where they made a kind of a counter-protest movement kind of thing, waiting for a true king to emerge and so forth, a Messiah, essentially. So by 116 BCE, the Hasmoneans had achieved full independence from the Seleucid kings, these Hellenistic kings of Syria, and their independent state was maintained from 116 to 63, so kind of a short-lived time period when it was conquered by Rome. So the territory ruled by the Hasmoneans is decidedly mixed. So there's a Judean Jewish core in Judea, a kind of an anti-Jewish Samaria, and then there's also kind of mixed Syrian Israelite areas in Idumea, which is the south, Edom, and then in Galilee in the north. So the Israelite groups present in the first century at the time of Josephus, the sects or schools he cited are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. These all emerged during this Hasmonean time. And as I mentioned, Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. This was founded in the late hundreds in the BCE by priests opposing Hasmonean rule. All right, so that gives us, this is the last of these maps, but essentially with now the Romans conquering the Greek East, including the Hasmonean kingdom and Egypt, now suddenly Greek and Roman influence is very big on the diaspora. Romans actually rule in the land, including when the Hasmoneans are replaced by the Herodian kings, which are puppet or client kings of the Romans. And so again, there's Mesopotamian, Persian influence and a big diaspora population in Babylon and so on, but that these are smaller during this time period. Again, Hellenization has been a major force for centuries by the time of Jesus's birth. So Herod's kingdom, when Jesus was born, or depending on when Jesus was born, a little bit before Jesus was born, depending on when he was born. But according to the Gospel of Matthew anyway, when Jesus was born, the kingdom was a client of Rome, ruled by a king who was neither Hasmonean nor Davidic. And so nobody was really happy with him except for King Herod and the Romans who he served. But Herod actually did become amazingly rich, and he was the greatest builder of the region's history. So he almost all of the oldest stuff that's around in Israel and Palestine and so on is actually built. The oldest stuff is built by Herod. There's been stuff obviously built since then by everyone, from the Crusaders to the Ottomans and so forth. So after his death, the Romans divided his inheritance. Herod the Great rebuilt the Second Temple on a grand scale. And this was, as it already was, the central focus of Jewish worship in that era. So we talked about these three schools cited by Josephus: the Sadducees, the Pharisees, and the Essenes. So who are they? So the Sadducees were the sect of the hereditary nobility. Under the Hasmoneans, they lost control of the high priesthoods. In other words, that Hasmonean dynasty took over the high priesthood. Nevertheless, they remained in Jerusalem as the priestly noble elite. In general, they were conservative. They had a more literal interpretation of Torah, and they specifically liked Torah and not the other books of the Hebrew Bible. So in other words, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. They reject the idea that there's also an oral Torah and the different doctrines that the Pharisees have. We'll talk about what those are. So the Pharisees are the sect of the scribal class. It's always tempting to want to say, interject, retroject anachronisms of, the upper class and middle class and so on. There wasn't middle class back then. But anyway, there's still an upper class because there's very much, everything is still, quite elite and not. But anyway, the scribal class were very learned in Torah interpretation. Sometimes they're called rabbis. Many people see the Pharisees as maybe the origin of kind of the rabbinic movement. The Pharisees emphasized purity law, although not as extreme as the Essenes will, as we'll see next. And they came up with an idea that there was an oral Torah, which is to say, at the same time that the 5 books of Moses and the 10 Commandments and so on were given to Moses, that there was also a whole bunch of tradition that was not to be written down, that was just to be passed down. And that allowed them, or gave them, the ability to update interpretation of the Torah for the present day. And so they're very interested in interpretation. And then there's a sect that lived apart, the Essenes. So the Essenes also claim to be the Zadokites, like the Sadducees, but rather than staying with the Hasmoneans and the Herodians and the Romans and ruling, they leave society. So they pull away. They probably, again, are the founders of Qumran, so the Dead Sea Scroll place. That's probably an Essene center. They live together in a sort of almost like what we think of as maybe a most monastic way, a strict priestly ascetic lifestyle according to kind of strict interpretation of Jewish laws, purity laws. And they considered, for example, the Pharisees to be very, very lax in their interpretation. In general, they're apocalyptic and restorationists, so they see the current order as being in apostasy, essentially, and they're looking forward to a savior who is going to overturn everything and restore the proper order. Okay, so going back to the Sadducees, what are their beliefs? So the Sadducees, according to Josephus, believe very strongly in free will and reject the idea of punishment and rewards after death. They can't find anything about that in the Torah. The Torah actually has very little on afterlife or heaven and hell. These are largely ideas that have entered into Second Temple Judaism, especially probably during that Persian period from all of that Persian and Babylonian influence. They reject resurrection and the immortality of the soul. Again, that's non-biblical. Resurrection is certainly part of Zoroastrianism. It's the religion of the Persian Empire and so on. They also reject the idea of spirits and angels. So all of the angels that keep appearing to apocalyptic prophets, like who are showing visions of heaven and so on, the Sadducees are not interested in any of that stuff. The Pharisees, by contrast, again, these guys are the specialists in the law. They are very open to interpretation, and they have a nuanced view, for example, that free will, in that free will divine omnipotence divide. So it's encapsulated here in a saying of Rabbi Akiva, who said, "All is foreseen, but freedom of choice is given." So we were talking about this as kind of central to, kind of this question of free will and determinism for Christians throughout all of theology and all of history. Is if God is timeless and is beyond time and is also all-knowing and knows what everything is going to happen, all is foreseen. But here, freedom of choice is given. In other words, just because God knows what's going to happen doesn't mean that you aren't still freely choosing that, even though you're like, how does that work? Okay, well, I mean, it's that nuance has been hard to figure out the mechanism of for thousands of years, but it's all the way back here with the rabbis. So they believe in resurrection, eternal reward and punishment, spirits, angels, and so forth. Finally, the Essenes. So these are those ascetics that are off waiting for the apocalypse. They believe in immortality, but they're very fatalistic in their emphasis, and that everything is occurring according to God's will. They, like ascetics do, reject pleasure and live a kind of a strict communal life might compare with later Christian monasticism when Christian monks go off into the desert and so forth to create communities. And they're very apocalyptic. So they believe that Messiah's saviors are going to restore the pure practices in the temple where it should be practiced, as opposed to where they're having to practice it on the shores of the Dead Sea. So I want to look at Jesus connected to each one of these as we kind of begin to wrap up here. So Jesus and the Sadducees. So the Sadducees are the nobles. Jesus is not a noble. He's not a Sadducee. In the Gospels as we have them, there's multiple attestation anyway that Jesus is in conflict with the Sadducees. Our most likely picture of Jesus' beliefs include things like resurrection and eternal reward and punishment, as well as the idea that there are spirits and angels. And so those are all things that the Sadducees don't believe in. So that's not, doesn't seem like, and again, there's much overlap between him and them. And Jesus is especially concerned with the poor and the marginalized, and he's condemning the elite. Woe unto you, rich, blessed are the poor, and so on. Well, the rich are the Sadducees, so he's saying woe unto them especially, and so forth. So he's not part of that group, although he's reacting to it, right? So let's look at the Essenes. So the Essenes, as I mentioned, they're apocalyptics. They believe that messiahs are coming, saviors are going to come. So Jesus obviously has his movement, and also the Gospels as we have it. There's apocalypticism. It's certainly a messianic religion, as Jesus ultimately is understood to have been the Messiah and therefore the Christ. That seems to align with the Essenes kind of generally. It may not be in their particulars. So we know a lot about the Essenes because of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they believe in all kinds of different things that are not particularly fully lining up with Christian texts. So Jesus' first followers, as we mentioned, led by his brother James, the poor of Jerusalem, as we've called them, they had an intentional community where they strictly lived the law and held all things in common, probably. That's what, anyway, is described and remembered in the New Testament texts. And James is remembered as James the Just in the sense that he is very rule-abiding, and indeed his conflict with Paul was over whether Jewish law needed to be incumbent upon Christians, where James believed it did. So those the Essenes are also very interested in Jewish law, although they may have a stricter or different interpretation. We'll see. So Jesus seems to have rejected asceticism. So asceticism is when you do all kinds of, let's say, fasting and or giving different things up, like living in that kind of way like a monk. So there's a line of criticism from the Sayings Gospel Q that's recorded in, that's remembered in Matthew and Luke, that the Son of Man came drinking, and anyway, the idea of it is that he's not fasting, is being criticized for not fasting the way John the Baptist fasted and so forth. And so you usually, when there's negative criticism from a positive source, it's more likely to be correct. So more likely to go back to him. So anyway, we're not sure, but it does seem like, although Christians later are ascetics, it's not necessarily clear that the historical Jesus was, is what I'm trying to say. So it's possible, though, a lot of people have made the case that John the Baptist is an Essene, so a better case can be made for that. So unlike Jesus, John was an ascetic, so he separated himself from society. He went off and lived in the wilderness like the Essenes did, in the same kind of area by the River Jordan. They're a little bit south of there. He's active near there. And like Qumran, where there is a lot of focus on mikvah washing, mikvah bathing, which is a Jewish custom that causes, alleviates ritual impurity, but it has to be done many, many times. John does repurpose that idea to teach a kind of a new, what becomes the Christian idea of baptism, which is more of a, not ritual impurity, but a one-time spiritual cleansing that is what John is even known for, being a Baptist. So his practices, differ from what we understand of the Essenes, but there's some things going on that are tantalizingly close. There's no way to make the case conclusively, I think, one way or the other. It's just a tantalizing connection. So what about being a Pharisee? In the Gospels, Jesus spends a lot of time with rivals who are Pharisees. Like the Pharisees, he's often called rabbi, which is to say master or teacher, master in the Gospels. Like the Pharisees, Jesus is portrayed as an expert, learned in Torah, who argues based on biblical law. And he also shares a lot of beliefs with the Pharisees, including the resurrection, spirits, and angels. So there's a lot of things that Jesus is concerned with, and background, at least as we have him portrayed in the Gospels, that seem a lot like his rivals, who the Gospels see as in a negative light, the Pharisees. And we also know that some of Jesus' followers, so Paul is a Pharisee before he's converted. So it's hard to say. So there's some tantalizing things. I would say, like, here's an example. Here's a counterexample. So in the Gospels, Jesus is portrayed as seeming to have rejected the central doctrine of Pharisees, the oral Torah. So you read this quote, and this comes from Mark chapter 7. When the Pharisees and some of the scribes who'd come down from Jerusalem gathered around him, Jesus, they noted that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without ritually washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, thus observing the tradition of the elders, and they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. And there are also many other traditions that they observe, the ritual washing of cups, pots, and bronze kettles. You can see that even here already, by the time that we're having the text of Mark, Mark is assuming an audience that doesn't understand Jewish law or custom. And so even already by the year 70, Christianity here is diverging a lot from its Jewish roots. But anyway, it still knows about them, but it's having to explain what's going on here. So the Pharisees and scribes they asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands?" He said to them, "Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, as it is written, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition.'" And so this last line here, you abandon the commandment of God, which is to say, let's say, written scripture, and you hold to human tradition, which is to say maybe the oral Torah. He seems to be saying in this anyway, a kind of a condemnation of one of these Pharisaic tenets, central ones. Nevertheless, the Pharisees argue with each other all the time. So it doesn't mean that doesn't make you not a Pharisee, even if you're in this environment, whatever. So what I want to say is, so if we are in North America here and we're looking at Judaism, pretty much we have the three major denominations within Judaism, Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox, that are making up kind of a third each, with Orthodox maybe a little less and Reform a little bit more. And pretty much everybody who's Jewish, who's religious anyway. I mean, there would be people who are not religious Jews, who are simply ethnic or cultural Jews, who maybe don't think of themselves as one of these. Pretty much everybody kind of fits into one of those denominations. These sects, though, that Josephus is talking about in the first century, these really only refer to a very tiny group, the elites and the people who are immediately influenced by them and so forth, whereas almost everybody else, the vast majority of people who would have identified as Jews or who would be identified as Jews wouldn't really be one of these schools or sects. And so there's plenty of room in there for Jesus's group. If it's like the poor of Jerusalem, to be its own little sect, that is not important enough to get mentioned much more than, other than a couple times by, not as certainly one of the major sects, though, by Josephus and so on. So let's conclude. So Jesus in the context of Second Temple Judaism. So although he may not have been a member of one of these leading schools as identified by Josephus, Jesus was nevertheless grappling with those same issues that they were. So all the things that are on the table that they're arguing about, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Pharisees back and forth with each other, this is also the things that Jesus and his disciples are thinking about. And to understand the historical Jesus, therefore, he has to be seen within the context of his Jewish roots. All right. That's the formal conclusion of the lecture, but now let's have some discussion. Drink your water first. And so, as always, as Leandro is assembling questions and sending those to me, I also have some discussion questions for you to be thinking about, and you can chime in with any of these, any thoughts or reflections you have on these. So can you think, first, number one, can you think of other examples of how Jesus responded to his context of Second Temple Judaism? So, this could be the Jesus of Scripture if you're thinking about stories that you know. How are those related to that context? Number two, what are some portraits or depictions of Jesus that stick out in your experience? And so this can be even 21st century portraits if you're thinking about it, or depictions and so on. We've done a whole range of them. I've showed everything from Chinese to Ethiopian Jesus and also the Mel Gibson. Three, what can or should Christians do to overcome historical legacies of mistreating, and obviously much, much, much worse, our Jewish cousins? All right. And so I'll let you think on those as I'm going to start to get questions from you. All right. So Godward Podcast asks, weren't there synagogues and a diaspora before the temple was destroyed? If so, why? The Torah didn't suggest that. So yes. So as I was saying, there's a diaspora. There's a diaspora when the first temple is destroyed. So to your point, to your question, from the destruction of the first temple to the destruction of the second temple, even though we call that the Second Temple period because, again, the focus is on that, the majority of the Jewish people are going to be living in the diaspora. And the diaspora is, so it's like Egypt, and Mesopotamia especially, but also across Syria. And then really by the Roman conquest and the Jewish colonies, Jewish merchants and so on go through a lot of the Roman world. So there's a lot of, there's a big diaspora community. So why are there synagogues even if they're not in the Torah? And so synagogue, it initially means, it's kind of almost the same word as, I mean, this is a Greek word, but it's almost the same word as ecclesia and church and so on. It's a community and gathering, and in these different communities, it's initially not a building. It's initially kind of a gathering to get together as a community when you are way too far away from the temple. And so even though the religion, especially as it's practiced very close to Jerusalem, is trying to always centralize. In fact, like the bulk of the members don't live anywhere where they can, let's say, easily go to Jerusalem. So some of them will make a pilgrimage there at a high holiday or something like that. But generally speaking, they're planted all the different places they've been ever since the kingdom of Jerusalem, the kingdom of Judah was originally destroyed by the Babylonians. So why are they there? They've been there since they've been in exile, and most of them don't ever go back to the land, in the same way that there's still a diaspora community today, even though many Jewish people have moved to the land and are now living in the state of Israel. There's plenty that are living here in Toronto. Okay. Dionysius Infinitum says, if Jesus himself preached about God, why have modern Christians seemingly deified Jesus as God? What caused the apotheosis of Jesus? Well, so what ends up happening is, again, that happened before we have the writings, right? And so what ends up happening is that Jesus is a leader in a movement, probably. I'm just making my own reconstruction here. He's crucified under Pontius Pilate. There isn't a big trial that, is not a big enough person or important enough to have a trial. There isn't likely to be a tomb at all. In other words, the tomb is a later apologetic in order to answer questions to prove that there was a resurrection and so forth that the Christian apologists have. But what ends up happening is his disciples are scared and then they flee in the face of Roman authorities. They don't really know what happens to the guy. He's thrown into a common grave in the way everybody who's crucified is. And then after that, some of Jesus's disciples start having visions of the risen Christ. And so because of that, maybe again, one of his important, maybe the first being his very important female apostle, Mary Magdalene, and then maybe some of the other apostles, Peter and the 12 and his brother James and so forth. They have visions of Jesus, and they start to see Jesus as having conquered death. And so they see him as resurrected and maybe sitting at the right hand of God and so forth. So from that, then other apostles like Paul really to kind of take off from there and develop a very high Christology. So he has a vision of the risen Christ as well. And his testimony is that Jesus is the glory of God, the logos of God. So this is already a concept that exists within Judaism, the Second Temple. You can't experience the first person of God. Essentially, you can't experience the Creator, who is unknowable and unseeable, but you can, like a prophet, can experience and see God's glory. And so the glory is what is the perceptible, the perceptible God. And anyway, and so Paul's testimony is you have to believe that Christ is Logos, that Jesus is Lord, Adonai. That's what the word is anyway used for glory. So anyway, the idea of it is that that develops fairly fast in terms of understanding the risen Christ as the Lord, as God's glory or Logos. So that's what caused it. Bob Garrison, would Jesus recognize Judaism as it exists today? Jesus, the historical Jesus, I don't think we'd be able to recognize much of anything that we have today as being very related to life in the first century of the Middle East and the Roman Empire and so on. I would say there are certainly things within Judaism that are the same. They were some of these interpretations and the way Jewish law was starting to be practiced. That was kind of being theorized in his time and starting to move from just priests only to the people more generally. Certainly, the texts are exactly the same. The central texts. Obviously, there's new texts that have been added, the Talmud and so forth, but the Torah, the Hebrew Bible is exactly the same. So he'd certainly recognize that part. The fact that there are scholars of Bible, rabbis, that certainly would be still familiar. So I'd say that there's a bunch of it that would still be familiar, probably more familiar than anything about Christianity, although we use the same Bible in translation and so forth. There's some parts of it that would be the same. Certainly, probably some of Jesus's own teachings have survived into Christianity, lots of them, and so therefore that would be familiar to him too. Sean Lancaster, how much of Jesus's anti-law actions, teachings do scholars think are historical versus later anti-Jewish propaganda of gospel writers? Yeah, that's going to be depending on your kind of model of how you understand the historical Jesus. And so we read that part of the Gospel of Mark. I kind of gave a long excerpt where other sects, the Pharisees and so forth, are complaining about lack of lack of purity. Obligations, not washing in terms of the cups and so forth, and Jesus supporting that kind of, let's say, more laxer or rather more spiritual interpretation. So in other words, Christians, there's a spectrum here, and Christians sometimes stereotype Judaism as being just concerned with legalism and not interested in the spirit of the law. And that's certainly part of the Christian teaching that's here. But Christians can be very legalistic too. And actually, Jews can be very interested in what the spirit of the law is too. So it's not a black and white issue. Rather, whenever you're talking about let's say law, and you are talking about interpretation, and you're talking about literalism versus the spirit of it, this kind of a spectrum. And so Christians are probably a little bit more into we're not going to do all of these things, X, Y, and Z, certainly not with Jewish law, but we're instead going to say, there's the spirit of this is not whether we are ritually clean. The spirit of it is whether we have kindness in our hearts and so forth, whether we're actually helping widows and so forth. So how do we know which one is it? So it may well be, it seems like, considering it's so central to the tradition, that Jesus is in the spectrum and he's arguing kind of more for the spiritual component of it. But, and like you say, it's also completely possible that, depending on your interpretation of it, that since that's kind of more where Christianity went, it's not dissimilar. So the criterion of dissimilarity doesn't help. And so when so when Christianity is going a particular direction, then it's we're less able to say that Jesus did that, because we know that Christians did that and they'd want to write it like that. So the answer is it's very hard to say. So I would kind of weigh it both ways on that. Catherine Mary Grandjean asks, you referred to the Torah, but what about the other books that we call the Bible? Jesus quotes Isaiah, so you must have studied it. So yeah, I when I was talking about Torah especially, I was thinking because the Sadducees especially were interested in that. But there's but the Hebrew Bible itself. So Torah is just the 5 books attributed to Moses, the Pentateuch, as it's called in the Greek, in the Christians. So that's Torah, and then there's also the prophets and the writings. And so for the Hebrew Bible, that's the Tanakh, which is pretty much the same as in terms of the number of books and so forth, as the Protestant Old Testament, so not the Apocrypha and so on. So the other books are important to Jews of the time, especially the Pharisees, the Essenes, and so forth. They're very interested in those. The Sadducees may be less so, the other books. They're kind of, I think, more focused on that. What about those other books? So those other books are important. So like you say, Jesus quotes Isaiah, and so at the very minimum, what we'd say is that the understanding of Jesus by the time we get to the gospel writers is that Jesus is learned in and is a student and studies the whole Hebrew Bible, not just the Torah, and is interested in the whole Hebrew Bible. Certainly for early Christianity, Isaiah especially really informs kind of Christian understanding of a lot of these kind of issues. If you go back and read Isaiah, there's a lot of already the kind of condemning of legalism and so on. That's already in Isaiah and so forth. Okay, Daryl Scott comments, John, you should try to do a guest episode on the Useful Charts channel. I would love to do a guest episode on Useful Charts. Useful Charts is a fantastic channel, and it's kind of a crazy. I've got a lot of things in common with the host of Useful Charts. So the host of Useful Charts, one, he makes charts. I also make charts. So we're both kind of chart makers. Two, he comes from an interesting background. So I was talking about Anglo-Israelitism, and I was talking about the history of that worldwide Church of God. And so the Useful Charts guy grew up in that church, the Worldwide Church of God, or actually an offshoot of that, and then left it and then converted to Reform Judaism. And so anyway, which is a very progressive religion that I consider to be a sister faith to our very progressive denomination that we have. And so, and I, in the same way, grew up in the LDS church and ultimately converted to Community of Christ, so a very progressive Christian church from a church that believes in all kinds of literalistic and problematic, falsifiable stuff like the Worldwide Church of God does. So yeah, I would love to do that. Hopefully I'll get to meet him someday and we'll do a crossover or something. Okay. Edie Lewis Reviews asks, where did this concept of oral Torah originate, and how did it come down to the Pharisees? And then Rain Weber also says, by oral Torah, does he mean the Mishnah, the Babylonian Talmud or something more inchoate. And so the Mishnah and the Talmud are not written in Jesus's time. And so the idea of it is, that there is, later the oral Torah is written, and so then it's not oral as much anymore, right? But this is an idea that is being formulated by the first rabbis here and potentially the Pharisees, and that their pretense is that there is supposedly an oral tradition in the schools where it's being passed down to them from Moses. This is not a this is not a. I mean, when we did this myth versus historicity lecture with the historical Jesus, we mentioned how the time period from even Moses to when the Torah is written, much less from Moses to when the Talmud is written or the Mishnah is written, it's already too long to preserve for Moses to Torah, and that's why Moses is not even a historical figure. Moses is a myth, right? And so same thing. So how do you get a oral tradition to be truthfully transmitted or perfectly transmitted for the whole whatever that is, a couple thousand years, all the way back to a mythical figure who didn't say it in the first place? It's not a claim that has any historicity to it. It may well still be understood as a faith claim, but anyway, where it comes from is it's something that the scholars of this time are theorizing about, and ultimately it becomes kind of central to how the rabbis start formulating it and writing it, and more important than whether there is such a tradition, which I've just said there isn't or argued that there isn't. Rather, it informs a tradition of having debate all the time, and so of the even of Rabbinic Judaism being a dialogue-based religion that even allows the rabbis to argue with Torah and ultimately with God. Is there more? Okay, Sean Lancaster asks, would Paul in Tarsus and Jesus in Galilee be more exposed to variant forms of Judaism, such as Samaritan practices, than those in Jerusalem? Did Jerusalem extend influence that far? So Jerusalem does extend influence, especially if, Jesus, at least we know, certainly in the tradition, he goes to Jerusalem a few times for different high holidays and so on. And certainly that's where, according to, a bunch of multiply tested, that's where he got killed, right? And so he does go there. So Galilee isn't so far away that you can't, not everybody travels, right? But anyway, that it does seem like an itinerant band of disciples and so forth are able to get between the two and go there at least occasionally and so forth. And Jerusalem is exerting influence because at different times, the areas that even include Samaria and Galilee are either part of Herod the Great's kingdom or various Herodian kingdoms of his different extended clan that descend from him. Excuse me one sec. Okay. But Paul in Tarsus, so he's up in Cilicia. So that's much more removed diaspora. Paul is still apparently up on, these different sects. I think he calls himself, a Pharisee at some point before he converted. He's very interested in the law, and also Paul, even though he's from Cilicia, he's down in the area because he's in the area of Jerusalem and Damascus and so forth at a certain point. So Paul is maybe more connected. I guess what I would say is there's going to be a lot of Hellenistic Judaism, Greek Judaism, that is going to be much more influenced by what, let's say, this massive Jewish community is doing in Alexandria than maybe what the leaders are doing in Jerusalem. So the leaders in Jerusalem are kind of focused on their own thing. They're receiving tithes and offerings and things like that from all around, and visitors and pilgrims, but they are communicating back out in Aramaic, and so it is not really getting maybe to this whole Western diaspora of kind of Greek-speaking Judaism, which is big and important. And so that's very, very different. In terms of the Samaritans, they're also really intertwined in terms of the local geography. Jesus interacts with the Samaritans in the Gospels. What we can kind of say is that by the time of that John's Gospel is written, a bunch of Samaritans have also become Christians, and so have been joined into this community, which has gotten kicked out of the Jewish synagogues. And so Samaritans are kind of making, in some Samaritans were making common practice, some of the Jews were too, and becoming Christians and so forth. So there is some interaction. Okay, Godward podcast. How much of Greek culture might Jesus have encountered? Could he have heard of Heraclitus, for example, as people came and went around Judea? So, how much is kind of really open to speculation. He could have known Greek, for all we know. I mean, but anyway, there's no particular reason to think he could. But Nazareth is like over a hill away from, some very big Greek colonies, Greek-speaking cities, that are the metropolises of the political elite, and so it's completely possible that people in Galilee of the working class, actually went to do work on building some of those cities and so forth. How much it's hard to say. I mean, in terms of Greek culture, the area, Galilee and so forth, and actually the whole area, it has already been more than 3 centuries of Hellenization. We talked about, those Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, who led that revolt against the Seleucids, the Greek kings of Syria, because of the trying to forcibly Hellenize them. But ironically, the Hasmoneans and the Sadducees often, because they're the rich elite, they often Hellenize more than anybody. Once you become a king in the Greek-speaking East, in the Hellenistic world, the only way to be a king in the Hellenistic world is to be like a Hellenistic king. And so the Hasmoneans adopt names like Alexander and so forth. They've made Greek Macedonian names, and they adopt that kind of culture. And so there is a lot of Greek around. So how much, Jesus encountered, it depends on how you build up your understanding of the historical Jesus and the context. Though it's right there. It's not like what people would want to do, where they say, "Oh, well, Jesus must have gone. We don't know what he did when he was a kid, so he probably went to India and studied Buddhism." So that didn't happen. It's not, the Buddhism isn't there, but there's definitely, Greeks are everywhere, right around it, or Greek people influenced by Greek culture. Okay, Han Thomas. Can you scroll this a little bit too? Han Thomas writes, what do you think of the more recent reconstructions of what Jesus would have looked like? For example, in one article, Jesus According to AI by Bas Uterich, inspirational people tend to look more charismatic than the image you showed us. I feel that reconstruction is used by people who are against Christianity or religion and using it in a mocking way. Look what your Messiah looked like for real. Well, yeah. And by the way, that I don't think that much of that reconstruction. I only use that to say that we should understand that Jesus would have had a Semitic background. In other words, he would have looked like Middle Eastern Jewish or Palestinian or Syrian person the same way, and anyway, as opposed to Chinese or Swedish, right? Even though he's sometimes painted those other ways. In terms of, I haven't seen this Jesus According to AI. I look forward to looking at that. I guess one of the things I think, I appreciate that this idea that charismatic people tend to look charismatic. On the other hand, peasants also look like can look like peasants, and charismatic people can be very charismatic, and without being beautiful or models or so on. One of the things that we have in the Restoration tradition is, going back to Joseph Smith. So once Joseph Smith, a very charismatic guy, I think nobody can deny that, in what he was doing. But once he was dead, the portraits of him that kept on getting, we don't have any photographs. And so the portraits get more and more handsome and model-like, and so my family member of mine who knew him as a boy and who lived into the, decades later and got to see the later portraits, he says, he made a comment like, these portraits we see of Joseph Smith would very much flatter him, because the real guy had a kind of a weird look to him. He had kind of a more of a sloping brow and this and that, things that don't get made into the portrait. He's a little, in the portraits from his life that we have, he's more penguin looking and so on. So I think it's very possible for a charismatic guy to not be a supermodel, but on the other hand, it's also possible for people like beauty, and it's also possible for, like you say, leaders to be. It's more likely he's tall. Leaders are tall, right? Just by percentages usually, because people are coded to. So to your point, people are coded to want good, follow good-looking people around, and also tall people and strong people and so forth. And so who knows? And probably because he's a leader, he maybe that particular image isn't as good. We can't have a real picture of Jesus, is what I mean to say. Okay, Bob Garrison. Are the places where Jesus was supposedly born, crucified, and buried really agreed upon by any historians as the actual spots? No, they are not. So in terms of the places that we have where Jesus was born, crucified, buried, and every other thing, there's every place on the in the entire Easter story, there's a site, the Garden of Gethsemane and where the trial is, and the whole road where he's carrying the cross. In other words, that's all figured out in a traditional and a religious sense. And some of those traditions go all the way back to the 4th century, when the Emperor Constantine converts his mother, who is a Christian, Helen, she goes to Palestine, and locals show her around and find all these artifacts, which she pays incredible amounts of money for, and she identifies all these spots, and they build churches there and so forth. And so it goes back to then, but there's not particular reason why, after, it had been 300 years, why many of these traditions are correct. And so they're traditional spots, but they're not historical spots. Bob asks, was Jesus probably illiterate? So we can't say, I think, probably. I mean, he's coming out of a class that's illiterate. He doesn't write. Those are strong arguments in that favor. But you can make the case. The case can also be made that he is literate. So that there are literate people in contemporary Judaism for himself, so Second Temple Judaism, because they are very interested in studying the Tanakh, the whole Hebrew Bible. And so, if so, so the case can be made either way. Amy Lynn Calloway says Jesus was trilingual, wasn't he? Again, we cannot say for that. So what's almost certain is that he would have had to speak Aramaic as the language he would have grown up. That's the common tongue that everybody was speaking. It's possible that he also knows Hebrew because he quotes the Bible and reads this Bible in the gospel stories, but those are written late, so we don't know for sure. And in terms of Greek, if he knew to be trilingual here, if he, I don't know. Maybe. So, I mean, I don't know if he's trilingual, but anyway, it's completely possible he's living next to all of these Greek-speaking people. So, I don't know what to say. Certainly, bilingual is certainly quite possible. Aramaic, for sure. So, Thumper says, what's the significance of Aramaic? Was there an Aramaic culture as well as a language? So, Aramaic it really just means Syrian. So Aram is the area around Damascus. So what we think of now as Syria. And so the area between Mesopotamia and Egypt, we now think of Syria because of modern Syria is just the little country of Syria. In some sense, though, Syria is all of the land between Assyria and Egypt. And so the people in this area, and actually even by this time, the Mesopotamians speak this Aramaic language, the Syrian language. And so the significance of it is that the empires had picked it up. It had been a commercial language, and it got picked up by the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the Persians, and made into kind of an official language of the Persian Empire. And so people used that for government business and trade and so forth. And at a certain point, local Semitic languages like Hebrew died out, except as a liturgical language. And so they still have Hebrew in order to read scripture, the same way that people in Italy still have Latin because of the church, right? And people in, people still use Old Church Slavonic, but there's all kinds of different cases where a liturgical language continues, religious language continues. Sumerian maintains itself way long past, the end of the Sumerian, anybody speaking Sumerian, and so forth. So, so this is the common language, is what you'd say. And so that's in terms of the culture. Yeah, it's the people also have a similar culture and customs and so on. So we sometimes call that Syrian or Syro-Phoenician, since the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, the Israelites, they're all in the Syrians, they're all the same kind of cultural zone. So Fastball Flake says, is there a scholarly consensus on Q? To what extent do scholars accept this hypothetical source? So it's a hypothetical source, and so it can't, therefore it's always has to be maintained that unless a document was ever found that is, that preserves Q, which seems, it's always possible that you can dig up scrolls like we've seen in Egypt with the Nag Hammadi scrolls, or in Qumran, but it's getting less and less possible. I would say that that Q remains the most accepted kind of consensus that scholars have on the answer to the synoptic problem. So you have to explain the synoptic problem somehow. And so I'd say that the Q hypothesis, the two-source hypothesis that includes therefore Q, is the most accepted one. It's like if you were reading the New Oxford Annotated Bible, you go to the notes, it just presumes usually Q. So as a fairly standard kind of baseline. But you always have to remember, you always have to be cautious, so that whenever there's whenever you're dealing with a hypothesis, you have to be sure it's a hypothesis. That's why I've been a little wishy-washy with can we say that Jesus is trilingual or not, and so forth. It's because it depends on how you argue it, right? So we can say he spoke Aramaic for sure, and then after that, there's a good case you can make for Hebrew, and Greek is in the neighborhood anyway. So there's a question: is it possible that Jesus and John the Baptist were Essenes? And so I did talk about that in the lecture. And so I said, yeah, it's possible. People have made the case. A lot of people have argued that there's a lot of overlap, especially between John the Baptist and the Essenes. And people have argued that Jesus may have been an Essene. I am not convinced by those. I mean, I think if anything, certainly not. For me, I don't think I'm not convinced that there's much to say that Jesus is an Essene. I think it's people have made the possible argument that maybe John the Baptist was raised in Essene and he's kind of a reformer who took it his own way and made a new thing. I'm perfectly happy with that. It's somewhat speculative. What I'd say is that these are ideas that are and peoples and thought schools that are in the immediate context that inform the context of the John the Baptist movement and Jesus movements.
Those are replies to your question.
Oh, okay. Roan Wagner has talked about my questions, which I don't have on the screen anymore. So the first one was, can you think of other examples of how Jesus responded to his Second Temple Judaism context? And he says, and Roan says, working or doing something on the Sabbath. And so there's several occasions when Jesus does things like healing on the Sabbath. So this is something that is taken right out of the Second Temple context as people are doing that kind of Jewish law observances. The second question was, what are some of the portraits or depictions of Jesus that stick out in your experience? And he says, I don't like statues or depictions of Jesus on the cross. And so, I would say, Roan, that's probably I would say that's showing a Protestant lens, probably. I mean, I appreciate that, but in other words, we've grown out of a tradition that comes out of Protestantism, and Protestants have, especially, in the same way initially Protestants didn't like crosses at all, and they later said crosses are okay, but not crucifixes with Jesus on the cross. And depicting the kind of suffering of Jesus and things like that became a particularly Catholic thing to do in the counter Reformation. And so kind of just embracing the kind of bodily stuff of it, whereas the Protestants went kind of all mental spiritual and wanted to get rid of, the physical kind of stuff like that. And so, I appreciate it because I have that same background kind of bias myself. And so I'm not personally a huge fan of those either, but I mean, we kind of also have to just be aware of where we're probably getting that a little as we have to step back and think about it in ourselves. And then the third question is, what can or should Christians do to overcome some of these historical legacies of just totally mistreating Jewish cousins? And Roan suggests that we learn from our differences and embrace what we have in common. And he says this would also apply to Muslims as well, to the third of the Abrahamic religions, and I agree, absolutely. There is a comment that some people want me to give a lecture on the prosperity gospel, and that's a good thing to talk about. We talk about the prosperity gospel and our opposition to the prosperity gospel in sermons even. So, okay. Mark B says, I'd like to learn about and understand Center Place. So Center Place here, where I'm at in Toronto, is this is the sanctuary. This is the church building for the Community of Christ Toronto congregation. The Toronto congregation is a venerable congregation within the Restoration Latter-day Saint tradition, getting all the way initially organized back in the 1830s when Joseph Smith and other Restoration leaders kind of came here, and the congregation here was first organized under a guy named John Taylor, who later ended up being the president of the church in Utah after Brigham Young died. Anyway, in terms of Center Place, there continued to be members who stayed here in Toronto. Those members united with what was called the reorganization, which now is known as Community of Christ, which are the people in the Restoration tradition who opposed polygamy and opposed a bunch of the other theological innovations of late Nauvoo Mormonism, temple practices, and so forth, and who came together under Joseph Smith's son, his wife Emma, and his son Joseph Smith III to have kind of a reform or more pragmatic version of the Restoration tradition. We've continued to evolve since then. Our part of our, we don't have a creed. Part of our kind of unofficial motto is truth wherever it's found. So as we are constantly, one of our missions initiatives is to develop disciples to serve, to continually learn and grow together. And so the lectures, we think, accomplish that by studying everything from our kind of extended heritage, that goes all the way back throughout the Western tradition, and as well as even comparative religion and so forth, so that we can better inform our understanding as we constantly seek to improve and develop. And so those are, there's a lot more you can see on our webpage, centerplus.ca. We have 5 mission initiatives, 9 enduring principles. We are a progressive Christian tradition church in the Restoration tradition, which is to say and the component of it, the Latter-day Saint movement, and specifically Community of Christ, which is the most progressive denomination within that movement. All right, well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for all of these comments. This is getting better and better, all of this dialogue. We have done a lot of that. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. Remember, I think this next week Thursday, we're talking about Machiavelli. And then next week, join us for the flood.